My name's Russ Glennon. I'm going to be chairing the session today, which is a very big honour. I'm very pleased to have quite a range of exceptional thinkers, I suppose, as opposed to speakers. Some of them pretty good at speaking as well. So thank you for that introduction, Felicity and Madeline. And I think that there are a number of learned societies represented here throughout the speakers and you as attendees. And this sort of collaboration, I think, is much needed between societies. You know, we are not competing, we are all working together. So what I'm going to do is introduce the four speakers. I'll introduce each one in turn. They're going to give quite a short kind of summary of where things are about their key topic or key issue that they're going to discuss. So instead of this being very lengthy presentations, we're really trying to keep it quite short, quite punchy, more about raising a number of questions for us to think about and to consider. And once we've had the chance to kind of hear from the four, we're going to go and then move into our sort of the slightly more traditional question and answer. And what we're really keen is to get your views. This is something we will, you know, to use the parlance, co-create in terms of a discussion. And that's the most sort of fascinating area, I think, for me. Across our four speakers, we've got a wealth of public sector management and academic leadership experience, scholarship engagement, far too many accolades and fellowships to mention, so I'm not going to do that, but I'll give you a brief introduction. I probably want to avoid it sounding a bit like those voiceover bits for the Great British Bake Off or Sewing Bee, where I say something like, as well as being a professor of public management and policy, Pete also enjoys a regular game of badminton. But I'll let them tell you if they want to about any of their hobbies. So with no further ado, we're going to move on to our first kind of brief snapshot, which is Professor Robert MacIntosh, professor at Heriot-Watt University. He's head of the School of Social Sciences and chair of CABS. And his research interests, which we will go through, have largely been around strategy, change, organisations, and he's going to be talking to us about a focus on higher education and some of the post-COVID changes that we either can see or we are going to be anticipating. So, Robert, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thanks for that, Russ, and good afternoon and good evening and good morning, wherever you are in whichever time zone. It's a delight to be with you this afternoon. And on this topic of liminality and the changing times and changing context in which we work, I wanted to just share with you a few observations about the funding of research and development in business and management subjects. As Russ said in his introductory remarks, I am also the chair of the Chartered Association of Business Schools, and so there's some shameless product placement in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and I sit on the council of the British Academy of Management. The UK funding of business research in our sector is something that I'm interested in the pattern that we see emerging. It's great to see our national government in the UK, the Westminster government, committing to increasing research funding. In fact, they've committed to doubling it, despite the pandemic and despite the carnage in the wider economy. And yet in that context, it's quite striking that UK business schools have received 33% less funding from the UK government than they did 10 years ago. And yet over the same period, particularly the STEM subjects have seen their research funding grow. And I thought I would just point out some of the difficulties that colleagues in schools of business and management across the UK face in sourcing funding for their research work. The Economic and Social Research Council is the ESRC. That's the main body to which most management or business academics would go to for funding. And right at the beginning of this REF cycle, and that's a very UK-centric term, so if you're not familiar with that, it's a biblical census of all the research that we do, which happens every 7 or 8 years. It last happened in 2014. And in the first year of the current REF cycle, for the 3,320 academic staff in business schools in the UK, there was one single award made by the Economic and Social Research Council to support management research. And that paints it firmly in the picture of lottery or Willy Wonka golden ticket territory. I mean, it really almost is not worth the bother of applying if there's a success rate of 1 in 3,000. And that hasn't improved much. It has improved a bit, but the most recent data that the ESRC shared was that in 2018-19, the total amount of funding that went to business subjects was 3.5% of their funding. And the ESRC is only one of a handful of research councils in the UK, and it's smaller than many of the others. So it's a small amount bottom left-hand corner of the screen, there's just a little bit of an image of the thing that we've largely forgotten about, which was Brexit. And I'm not going to be drawn into any political arguments as to whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but it's certainly changing. And over the same 10-year period in which our funding from the UK government has gone down, the dependence on EU research funding has more than doubled. And it's currently about a third of all of the funding that flows into UK business schools comes from the European Union. And there is as yet no firm commitment as to whether we will continue to participate in European Union frameworks for research. And so that is it's a highly changing landscape. The second thing that I thought I would share very briefly with you is a snapshot of a survey that I ran for the Scottish Government's Advisory Group on Economic Recovery, which we asked about 200 businesses, large and small, public and private and charitable, what they were thinking about the medium-term prospects for recovery. And what we found were some things which were not that surprising. 60% of respondents plan to think that they'll need less space in a few years' time. So being in the kind of office retail space market isn't probably a great idea. Lots of organisations, more than 40%, see the need for significant reskilling, and predictions in particular of much less in the way of cashless transactions than particularly for smaller businesses, which throws up lots of interesting questions about taxable income and so on for smaller businesses. But particularly the larger organisations, and actually strikingly particularly the public organisations, thinking that they will need many fewer square foot of office space, and not everybody will be in the office at the same time. So for us as academics, that universities are in much the same space. Will they need the same amount of space for our staff? Will we need the same amount of space for our students? And so if we move on to the next slide, the landscape in which they're doing is changing dramatically. And there's obviously a huge focus in the immediate short term on the science end of that spectrum. So where we will get a vaccine from and how we will do testing and tracing. But my view is that the economic impact will be at least as big as the medical impact, and that what we need desperately is to see good quality research from management schools to supplement the recovery and to build a recovery which is both inclusive and sustainable and resilient. And that'll take me to my final slide because I can see the clock ticking down. Thank you, Richard. And my final slide is this. It's a quote from a paper by Anne Cunliffe on social poetics, which is a fantastic read. If you haven't read it, I would highly commend it to you. And she suggests that you can't just click your heels and go back to the old normal. There is definitely something different happening. And the image that you see is actually, I thought, a really striking image. It's of a road safety campaign from Iceland, and it's an actual picture. It's not an illusion. It's the paint on the road makes it appear three-dimensional. And that strikes me as being a bit like the landscape in which the research that we do in our schools of business and management is occurring. It's almost not what it used to be. And it's what you see in that liminal space. And so I definitely don't think we can go back to the old normal, but I'd be really interested to see how research in this area could support a new normal. And at that, I'll drop there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Robert. That was an excellent short snapshot. So now we're going to move to Dr. Joanne Murphy, who is a senior lecturer at Queen's University Belfast. And thank you very much for agreeing to host the session today. On behalf of the William J. Clinton Leadership Institute, of which she's academic director. Joanne's research has been focusing around leadership and change, but particularly in volatile and extreme contexts. And she's going to be talking about the war on COVID-19 and how that's been framed. So over to you, Joanne.
Just unmuting myself there. Thanks very much for that, Russ. That's great. And welcome everybody to this event, and particularly welcome on behalf of Queen's University and the William J. Clinton Leadership Institute. We've been delighted to be able to host it. And I think it's a really important series of presentations that relate to, I suppose, different issues and different concerns that we have around the current COVID crisis. I suppose if we just move on to my first slide, what I'm, excuse me, what I want to talk to you about really, I suppose, is a different perspective on how we begin to think about COVID-19 and the kind of situation that we've been in. And I suppose, you know, I was looking at these slides earlier and I thought we're beginning to kind of come out of that sort of emergency feeling that I think we all had at the beginning. If you remember back to the very beginning of the crisis, we had lots of political leaders and organizational leaders coming out and talking in really kind of extreme terms about what was facing us and where we were going to be. So what I kind of wanted to do was to, just in these few minutes, just to frame this challenge the way that a lot of the media framed it, and a way that it was being framed in a lot of conversations, and that was as a war or as a struggle, or almost like as a conflict in terms of the pandemic and the environment we're in. Now that, I mean, I just found this little picture. I think it's really interesting. There's lots and lots of this stuff on the internet. You know, a day in the life of a COVID-19 warrior, you know, even that, you know, that terminology and that imagery is very interesting and engaging. So what do we sort of know about the kind of environments that we've faced and the kind of emergency and risky contexts? Well, you know, the reality is, from the academic literature, we know lots and lots, and most of what we know, you know, comes from this really exciting and interesting literature around extreme contexts and the role of groups and teams and leadership within those contexts. So I suppose I wanted to talk a little bit about that leadership. I wanted to talk, I suppose, just a bit about, you know, why those contexts are so difficult, to try to put a little bit of a frame around that. You know, we know that these contexts are, you know, rapidly compressed decision making, which intensifies the impact, you know, of the volatility in the wider environment. We understand, of course, that they're highly dynamic, they're changing all the time, they're interconnected, and they're interdependent. And that in itself can lead to conflicts over authority, conflicts over domains, jurisdictions, you know, who can say what, and that sometimes leads to a lack of action, you know. So we just want to put that sort of, I suppose, that kind of context around it in terms of what we're talking about. And I suppose, you know, where a lot of people are beginning to think about is the lessons that we've learned during, and then the lessons, you know, that hopefully we'll learn after, in that kind of hindsight place. We just move on to the next slide. So, you know, there's a lot of literature around this. There's a lot of stuff that we already know. I wanted to I suppose, talk a little bit just very quickly about leadership and the significance of leadership. You know, we tend to be so actor-centric in terms of our perceptions of leadership, but it's probably more helpful to think about these leadership configurations, you know, some really interesting stuff around that. And also, you know, the importance of networks within these kind of processes, these sort of extreme environments. Just move on to the next slide. And I suppose I thought, for me, the most important thing to give you today was really a perspective from those people who have been in extreme environments like this, and what they learned about leadership and working in teams. I've got a couple of pictures here. The first one is of a guy called Ismet Kumalik. Ismet Kumalik was the civilian administrator in a part of Dobrinja in Sarajevo that was almost entirely cut off during the Bosnian wars and the war in Bosnia. And Ismet Kumalik was fascinating because Dobrinja was one of the places that almost became self-sufficient. They grew a lot of their own food. They were able to build tunnels, 20 kilometers of tunnels around the neighborhood, so people could move from one building to another to avoid sniper fire. And because he was the leader, he was carrying a lot of that stuff. And what he did for us when we met him was he drew us a diagram of what it was like to lead within that kind of an environment. And he talked about the leadership pyramid being almost entirely inverted. It's a really kind of interesting quote. You're not that important. When you're the leader in that environment, you're carrying everybody else on your shoulders, you know, which is such a thing to think about in terms of the extreme environment we've been through. He also talked about the significance of organization. You know, organization is everything. You have no time, and when you don't have any time, you still have to make decisions. And when you don't have the time to think about those decisions, what you actually need is bravery and courage. And again, when we go back and we think about the early days of COVID, I think that's really resonant in terms of the environment we've been through. The other thing I wanted to say to you is this idea of cultivating a belief that we'll get through things. I've done some really interesting research in the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin, and one of the kind of things that you hear again and again when you interview the people in DFA, particularly in relation to peace processes and conflict, is they talk about the significance of having a duty of hope, which I think is a wonderful phrase, the idea that you have a duty of hope, a duty to yourself and a duty to the people, you know, within your organization as well. So we just move on to the next slide. So one of the things that kind of help us move through these processes, spoken about them already, very little time, unfortunately today, to go into any more detail, the significance of courage, you know, the courage to distribute authority, to acknowledge mistakes, to take responsibility for those mistakes, and awareness of resilience, whether that's organizational or personal resilience and all the stuff that's around that, you know, being able to cope with complexity, something that leaders find really, really difficult within organizations, particularly whenever there's a huge amount of volatility in the system. The significance of boundary spanners, and of course I'd like to end on the importance of a duty of hope.
Okay, so I'm not as quick as unmuting as I was hoping. Thank you very much for that, Joanne. So that's 2 through. Just a good chance for me to remind you that you can ask questions via the chat function, so I would really, really encourage you to do that, to put some of those questions down. We've got a little bit of time after the 4 speakers where I'm going to get some interactions between the speakers about some of the issues that have been raised, and we'll try and draw some things together as a topic for conversation. So do, you know, make sure you get some questions down, and Felicity is then going to put them to the speakers in that session. So I shall now hand over to Professor Alma McCarthy from the National University of Ireland, Galway, who is Professor of Public Sector Management and Head of the Management Discipline there. And she's going to be looking at her research specialisms around leadership, human resources, organisational development. Okay, so I shall hand over now to Alma.
Thank you, Russ, and good afternoon to everyone, or good morning or good evening as it may be. So thanks to Joanne and everyone for organising this session, and it's very nice to be a part of it. If you just want to move on to the next slide there, I'm going to speak a little bit about, I suppose, looking at public sector human resource management and how the human resources of the public service have responded to the crisis. And I suppose one of the things that has come out of COVID-19 is really looking at and getting us to start to think about and question how we value our public service and our frontline workers. And there has been a lot of debate and discourse about that. And certainly the value that we'll say nurses and doctors, police, Garda Síochána in the Irish context, cleaners, a broad gamut of workers that have to put themselves on the front line. And I suppose, you know, that's a big question going forward, is how as a society we value some of those roles that some would argue have not been valued to the extent they should have been in the past. And it's only with this pandemic that we start to see and we start to actually really draw attention to those critical workers within our society. We have a lot of good examples of public servants, as we call them, or public sector workers who have had to adapt very quickly and readjust to managing the crisis. So for example, in the Irish context, there's some very interesting statistics around our Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, where they, in managing the unemployment payments, etc., that have come as part of COVID, there was a statistic presented by the Secretary General of that department to a Dáil committee recently, where he stated that 4 years of work of social welfare claims were processed in 5 weeks. When people were moving over to the pandemic unemployment payment and other schemes that we have here in Ireland. So that's quite incredible. 4 years of social welfare payments processed in 5 weeks. And I think a lot of the time in the media, you know, down through the years, there can be a lot of negative attention placed on public services and some staff within some areas. So that statistic I think is very interesting, and, you know, credit is due hugely there to that as one example of a cohort that has really responded and moved. And a lot of people in the civil service side have moved over to contact tracing in different roles, and that seems to be happening very effectively. There's maybe some inconsistencies in the response. I know that there's a bit of discourse around how the primary education sector has responded, or not necessarily responded very cohesively or with any great consistency. So that's, I'm not saying that it's across the board, but there certainly are some very good examples, and we have to pay attention to that, I think, when we think about our human resources in the public sector. In the Irish case, I think it's generally accepted that our political and public health leadership has been key to the Irish response, and they have been quite united. And, you know, at the outset, we were lucky in that there was a very united front politically and from a public health perspective. And I think that helped us to manage the crisis very effectively up to this point. It'll probably be a bit more challenging as we go forth now, because people have different views and we start to see a little bit more divergence coming into it. But certainly when we shut down and the initial stages were very much followed by the majority of people. So I suppose, what opportunities does the crisis bring for change? So out of every crisis, nobody wants to be in this crisis. Nobody wanted or could have contemplated dealing with COVID. We have to deal with it. And what opportunities might the crisis bring for change and for public sector change, or for how we think about how we manage in organisations? So if we just move to the next slide now there, please. I was involved in a national remote working survey here in Ireland, where we gathered data on remote working. We were all required to remote work where we possibly could by government regulations to deal with the outbreak. So anyone at all that could work remotely had to do so. So we got over 8,000 responses in over a 2-week period, the end of April and May. So it's very fresh and very contemporary data dealing specifically with remote working in the COVID context. For today's presentation, I've just pulled out public sector respondents. So we had 3,800 public sector respondents, and I just pull out some very top headline statistics. And interestingly, they align with what Robert spoke about there at the start, with the whole sort of, Robert mentioned about the actual space. And as I work through this, you'll see that the employee voice here is corroborating that. So this was a survey of employees and how they were dealing with remote working. So it's the employee perspective. 63% of the public sector respondents to our survey had never worked remotely for any period of time before COVID. 45% were saying that it was easy or somewhat easy to work remotely, and 40% were saying it was difficult or somewhat difficult. The top 3 challenges cited for working remotely where collaboration and communication with co-workers is much harder, more difficult rather, and not being able to switch off from work, and physical workspace. And when we delved into that, there's a lot of people are working where they don't have, we'd say, an office space, or they don't have good, good ergonomic desk and computer and printer, etc. If you want to move on there to the next slide, please. The top 3 advantages cited were no traffic and no commute, reduced costs of going to work and commuting, and greater flexibility as to how people manage their working day. And as I say, I'm focusing specifically here on public sector respondents only. One of the key findings was, and talking a bit to what Joanne has talked about around leadership in her presentation, which is very interesting there, 79% of respondents were either confident or very confident in their organization's leadership team to manage the decisions through the crisis, which is quite high. And sometimes we see people can be more cynical about, I suppose, their leadership in organizations. So 79% here feel that they have confidence in their organization's leadership. A really interesting statistic, and I think it'll speak to maybe what after COVID is, now this is employees' perceptions, if you just want to go back there for a second, please, to the last slide, yeah, is around productivity. As I say, it is the employees' perceptions of their own productivity. It would be good for us to try and corroborate this with an employer input in due course. But 63.7% of respondents there are saying that their productivity is the same or higher. So that's really, really interesting. And I would say it's probably a very, very challenging time, because we don't have the normal childcare supports, school context, elder care supports that people might have for anyone that has caring responsibilities. And that was quite a big percentage of the response rate. So, 34% are saying that their productivity is about the same, and nearly 30% are saying that it's actually higher. Again, a very interesting statistic from an organizational perspective, organizational psychology and management perspective. And moving on to the last slide, I'm conscious of time as well. I suppose going forward then, what, and I posed the question in the first slide, what can we learn or retain or sustain from the crisis? 80% of the respondents to the survey want to continue to work remotely post-COVID. So 41% several times a week, 28% several times a month, and 10% daily. So 80% want to continue to work remotely, chiming directly with what Robert talked about there in terms of actual space and the idea that going forward, how will organizations respond to this? 80% of employees in this national survey, and we have quite a big response rate, are saying they would like to continue to do so. The challenges in being able to do continue to remote work, then I've put them up here in terms of what's most cited, their organisation will not support it. The second highest response was that there are actually no challenges to continue to do so. Inadequate equipment and resources, or that their nature of their work doesn't allow it, or their manager won't allow it. So I suppose going forward, the questions that I would pose is, and just looking specifically here at the group of public sector respondents we've here, the employee voice is very clear. There is a desire to continue to work remotely, and that brings many benefits if it's set up correctly for work-life balance, etc. We see that combined with perceptions of productivity, which are quite reassuring, I would say, for a lot of organizations if they were to look at it. So how are public sector organizations going to respond to this particular issue going forward? I think it does provide a lot of benefits beyond the organization. It provides benefits in terms of the environmental impact as well. And I think that has been one of the positives that we really have to start thinking about out of COVID. Interestingly, the Irish government, the three parties have come together in the Irish context to vote. We'll know the outcome today. I haven't been following media now, but on whether the programme for government for the next 5 years will be, 4 years, sorry, will be ratified or not by all of the three parties that have come together. And in that programme for government, there is a commitment. The statement is that there will be a mandate for 20% of public sector employees to work remotely in 2021. So it's very interesting that that has actually appeared, and remote working appears something like 12 times in the programme for government. So if that programme for government, and if that's voted in by the members of the political parties today, we potentially see a move at a government level to push for it. We see that employees now are looking for it, public sector employees, and then it's just around how public sector organisations can respond. So I suppose in linked with that, how can we sustain the resilience and build more effective and a more responsive public service? I've taken one particular lens here today, is just looking at the employee voice and looking at remote working, and maybe that's a new way to do things. One of the challenges we have with remote working in the Irish context is we had in the public civil service context, a decentralisation programme here nationally many years ago, and it has quite a checkered past. And I think that, you know, a lot of the time when working from home or remote working has been mentioned as a way to sort of maybe change how we actually work, and looking at where we work, the older notions of some of the challenges we have with decentralisation start to surface. But remote working, if it's managed properly, can actually be a really positive thing that we will come out of this, because we were forced into this social experiment. I'm not saying remote working comes without any challenges, not by any manner or means, but it's, our survey has been very enlightening in looking at the potential opportunities and looking at the employee voice. And the last point I would make is that public service capacity development and people-centric leadership really is a key theme to come out of this. Joanne mentioned it, and speaks a bit to what Robert said as well. And the central place that our key public sector employees play is critical. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alma. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Pete Murphy from Nottingham-Trent University. Pete is Professor of Public Policy and Management, and excuse me, is also a REF panel member, so I'm sure he'd be delighted to answer any questions about the REF that you should have. We'll wait and see. And Pete is going to be looking at bringing on his experience around public service at central government and local government, and thinking about the sort of democratic and political operations. So I shall hand over to Pete now.
And I've just experienced one of those challenges since my internet went down when Robert was speaking. Apologies for my colleagues who I missed. I just managed to get it back up. So if I repeat anything that my colleagues have said or contradicted them completely, then we'll resolve that later. But I'm just going to talk about the English policy landscape. Tony Blair had his 4 C's for best value. So I tried to come up with the 4 C's of the Johnsonian administration to date. The thing I came up with is that the policy landscape in England at the moment is complex. It is also confused. At times it is contradictory. And if I had to have a 4th C, I would say it has a casual affinity with the truth. So I'm going to talk about domestic policy, social, economic, environmental policy, and the direction of travel of Johnson's administration, with the exception of the fact that he's thrown a lot of money at COVID, and we have Brexit come along, there's not that much difference from the direction of travel that we've been going in under Cameron and May before him. But if you look at those characteristics that I've put up on the slide, we have the rise of populism both in the existing parties, existing policies, and in new parties. And we've gradually moved, as I think people have heard me say before, from an evidence-based policy making, which was the mantra, if not always the experience of the previous Labour administrations, to a policy-based evidence making, through policy-based evidence making to evidence-informed policy work. And now we have the complete evidence-free policy making, where public policy in England is largely being made on the hoof, more by fiat and decree. My colleague Pete Eckersley says there is a complete triumph of politics over policy. We've got the return of short-termism. The one other thing that I would pick off that slide is the endemic short-termism has undoubtedly led to underdevelopment and underinvestment in our long-term infrastructure. So we get to March 2020, and in terms of public health, what is England facing? Well, it's facing, for the first time for many years, falling life expectancy. All age, all cause mortality in England is going down. For the first time for many years, we have reversed the reductions in health inequalities, and health inequalities in England are rising again. As we've seen from COVID, we've underinvested, we've got underinvestment in our infrastructure, and we've got an overloaded infrastructure. And this at the time were the contradictory policy of the government in this area is to try and solve the great national dichotomy of moving towards integrated NHS and social care services. And we are supposed to see comprehensively across the country integrated care systems implemented by 2021. So if you just see how long it is since we've failed to be able to get a coordination, let alone integration of health and social care, you'll see just how realistic such an ambition is. And integrated care systems require some of the characteristics that I've given on slide 2. That your policy must be integrated policy and integrated delivery, and there must be collaboration between two. I'm not going to go through all of the bullet points on that slide because I'd take all of your time, but I went back to, before I became an academic in 2009, 2010, I went back to the direction of travel just before I left government as the director of local government. And I found a speech I was writing for the minister that was talking about the future trends that we would like, that the government at the time would like to see. And it isn't that much different from those characteristics on those slides. In my view, setting up the things that would have delivered integrated care systems and probably given us a much better response to the challenges of COVID have been for 10 years ignored. So what's the response? What has been the response of COVID? If you go to the next slide, my question would be, which of either set of these characteristics is likely to assert themselves, reassert themselves? Which of these characteristics are best deployed in response to COVID-19? And which characteristics are best deployed against a policy challenge that everybody must see the similarities which is long-term climate change and the challenge that that gives us. Robert stated earlier a terrific conclusion for us, and I hope he remembered to keep it in his slide, otherwise this sounds as I've pinched it. But the challenge for researchers, and I think for policymakers, is to build a more sustainable, resilient, inclusive economy. And we've got to do that by cultivating all the assets that are available to us. The problem I see at the moment is the politicians' response to COVID is characterised by the first slide, and the NHS, and to a lesser extent the local authorities in England, are characterised at least by the desires and the characteristics on the second slide. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete. Okay, so actually I'm going to hand over now to Professor Robert Galavan from NUI Maynooth, and Robert is Chair of Strategic Management, and he's going to bring together, I think, some of the thoughts that we've had so far from the 4 speakers.
Thanks, Russ, and hi everyone. Yeah, so I have 2 jobs really to do in the next couple of minutes. So this is about a 2-minute or 3-minute roundup. One is to do the little roundup, and the second hidden thing behind it is to give everybody a chance to ask some interesting questions in the background. So this is the couple of minutes to think back over the presentations we've had. Pop your questions in the chat, and Felicity will work furiously in the background to make sure that they get to the right speakers and that we're ready to go. And I think that might be the most interesting part of the session when we do that. I'm not going to go back over each individual speaker. I'm going to try and draw out the sort of the themes that jumped out from me through it. So this isn't the truth of what has just been said. It's just my interpretation of them in there. And I think one of the things that we start with is this sense of a belief that there will be a new normal, that we aren't going backwards. Somebody said that Humpty Dumpty had fallen off the wall and we weren't going to put him back together again, or at least I think if he goes back together, he'll look a little bit different to the time that he did. And you know, the very physical manifestations of that are the space that we work in, and whether we're working from home. But sitting behind that are a whole load of other softer things that aren't as visible and aren't as tangible. And over again through all of the conversations, we've heard about conversations about trust and about confidence in leadership. And also the way the system around us is changing, or at least our recognition of that is changing. To a recognition of the complexity of the world that we are living in, maybe brought more to the fore now because of the time pressures in terms of trying to make decisions and the uncertainty that that brings. And one of the things that has struck me over the last few months is a dawning realization on a lot of people that uncertainty is not the same as risk. That we try and model risk in ways to say is, look, you know, what's the percentage likelihood of this happening? But we need some data to do that. Whereas the COVID experience has said to us, well, look, there are circumstances where we simply can't calculate the risk because we don't have the data. We know the uncertainty is in there, and yet we still need to keep the system moving and the system moving along to do that. So what do we do with the system? And I think what I've taken out of today is that what has become important is a focus on the networks and the collaboration. So not so much on the individuals, but on the groups and the systems that actually work together to bring us through that. Their means of communication and their struggles to connect, as Alma said, in terms of the feedback that they got from their research, that people are worried about how they collaborate and how they work together. But very importantly then in all of the talks, I think came through was this need to have trust. A belief in our leadership, a confidence and a trust in the people that we're working with to bring us forward. And I think we're moving to an interesting space of, you know, a sense of looking or searching for trust in an individual to actually looking for trust in ourselves is where we need to go. That the solutions to these problems don't exist in one leader at the top, and we have a way to go to try and find that. And part of the way of building that trust is to help and support people to build resilient systems through capacity building of our organizations and our people and our groups and our teams to come together and do that. In the final talk, Peter talked about being complex and confusion and a casual affinity with the truth, which I liked. So much of that rings true in there. And this movement that we've had over time from evidence-based true to what surely does feel at times like it is evidence-free in terms of where we go. And at the same time, the system asking those responsible within it, building on poor infrastructure and underinvestment and short-termism and all of those things, to move towards, in one example, integrated care systems, but in lots of ways, lots of integrated approaches, a recognition that perhaps the hierarchy and the silos that new public management brought to us in past eras have come to a point where we are sure now that they don't work. I think interestingly, we stole them for the public service from industry right about the time when industry gave up on those particular things. So we need to try and find these ways of building resilient systems. And for sure, these resilient systems aren't built on hierarchies. They are definitely evidence informed, but that evidence informs experts, not necessarily somebody who read a tweet and said, I now know everything there is to know about that subject because somebody tweeted on it the other day. And we've had this temptation, I think, to look for simplistic answers to really, really complex things, while at the same time disavowing the value of having experts in the background trying to do those jobs. So I think maybe where we're at as a point coming out of this, and the opportunity coming out of this, is a recognition that we need systems that have trust built within them, that requires a sense of resilience inside that. And that maybe we could stop this silly search for heroic leaders that can give us certainty and bring us simple answers to all of our problems. And a recognition that it is working through the difficult, complex, uncertain, messy systems and messy problems that we've got that will get us there into the future. And that just because a politician gets up and shouts that they have the answer, it doesn't mean that they necessarily do. So that's what I took from it, a personal reading of it, not necessarily a reflection of all of our speakers, but a personal reading of what I heard come through today.
Okay, so we now move to Felicity, who's going to facilitate the question and answer session for us.
I should apologise there that my own institution, I didn't spot that, is Waterford Institute of Technology. It'd be lovely to be in Maynooth as well, I'm sure. So if I could please, I've been gathering all of your questions, but actually I'm going to ask the last question first, if you don't mind, to the panel. The term that was used in the title of the event was liminal space. Can you speak a little more about that term and why it was used as the title of this event?
So I'll have a go at that, Felicity. First, liminality, of course, is this transition from one thing to another, and this sense of being neither one thing nor the other seems characteristic of the time that we live in on multiple levels. In the immediate short term, there's the liminality of lockdown and its phased release. In the slightly more relaxed time frame of, say, a year or two, there's the sense of being part of a global trading bloc in the European Union or not, and the sense in which our political systems are stable or unstable. And, you know, I think Peter's turn of phrase of the day is a kind of a casual affinity with the truth seems to characterize many of the macro political narratives that we see around the world. And so I think we chose the phrase liminality because it speaks to this very betwixt and between sensation in which we find ourselves. And yet, as scholars of management and organization studies, we should be speaking with a confident voice into that vacuum with a sense of what can usefully be done to try and make the best of a very difficult set of circumstances. That's how I would answer Richard's question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think we were trying to speak into this space of a before and an after, you know, and the pandemic particularly, you know, I think we're still in that space, but particularly at the beginning, there was a definite feeling that we were entering an environment which none of us really understood. And I think it's important as well, because some of the, you know, the research around liminality is beginning to look at this concept of permanent liminality. And I think for a while we did think that we would go into this space and then we'd come out of it again. But increasingly it's beginning to feel that this is going to go on for a very long time. And actually possibly, you know, it's going to change how we see the world. I don't want to say permanently, I'm scared to say that, but it'll have a huge effect in terms of our view of the world. So it seemed like an appropriate lens with which to look at this series of events.
And if I could just add, I think for me, liminality, the root of it is the Latin word for threshold. So it's really about things that are, as we said, on the boundary, on the edges of spaces. And as Robert said, sort of things that are neither one thing nor the other. And I suppose from the sense of the, as Pete said, the very confused policy environment, I personally feel like I'm in a kind of Schrodinger's lockdown. I've been shielding because of personal health reasons. I have type 1 diabetes. But my status as a shielding person appears to have changed. And it's kind of really unclear to me why it has and why it hasn't. And I'm relatively au fait with what's going on in the world and pay attention. If you are struggling with these things, how can you make sense of what is happening around that? So I think for us, this liminality, this sense of things on the edge and the boundaries, whether that is around the policy environment or sectoral changes or the economy, or the public and private sectors and where those interfaces are, was sort of very much, and as again, as Joe said, sort of at the heart of our goal for this.
Yeah, there, Felicity, you're muted at the moment, Felicity, anyway. Yeah, I mean, the sense of liminality for me actually rings true in terms of complex systems as well, because, you know, we hear a lot about in complex systems living at the edge of chaos, and it's not a chaos that you're about to fall over, but that space becomes the really creative space where there's so much energy in the system, and the system is so fluid that sometimes, you know, relatively minor things might actually cause new forms to emerge out of it. And we've been sort of hung and caught into a way of working. The university system, I think, is a great one, where everybody insists on having their own office, but largely nobody goes into them, or at least not for long periods of time. And all of a sudden now that, you know, that truth has been told to the world, that really we don't need to be in there for vast amounts of the things that we do. And so, you know, that for me is one of those things where, you know, the system had enough energy within it, and all of the bits that were holding us to that old system might actually change in new ways. And I hope there's lots of opportunities in organizations to recognize that, look, there's just so much energy there now and so much fluidity, that we might actually switch into some new and interesting states where we go back maybe to trying to see the role of management and management research to a large extent as trying to figure out how to improve people's lives, and not just trying to figure out how to drive productivity.
Interestingly, the conversation line in terms of the chat has spoken about this concept of new normal. And the next question asks about what can be normal in this liminal space. I think it's a nice continuation of the commentary around that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think there's probably, you know, Russ has alluded to it already, there's probably a different normal for different people. You know, it's very difficult to come up with a kind of comprehensive analysis of what has actually changed and where the shading within that change is. I think it's a fascinating thing, but I don't think we have any real idea yet. You know, we keep hearing about second waves, we keep hearing about, you know, regional outbreaks and really what's going to happen next. We're no further forward in terms of a vaccine. You know, we seem to be moving forward in terms of treatments, which is fantastic news. But, you know, big issues the issues that are emerging are around the kind of health consequences in the long term of people who contract the virus. So really, really complicated, but it is definitely a different type of normal. You know, whenever I kind of think about it, Margaret Atwood has a fantastic quote in one of her books about events that change the passage of time, you know, and that's what this feels like. You know, she talks about marriages and deaths and wars, but this is kind of something similar, I think.
Robert, I know that you had a comment there in the chat line, but you may like to elaborate on that in relation to this question.
I suppose for me, the thing that was going through my mind is this double loop sense of not normal being quite normal these days. I mean, I've had a slightly Groundhog Day sensation of waking up and discovering that there's a different president in North America, and waking up and discovering that we've got a different configuration of European relationships, and waking up and discovering that we've got our current UK government, and waking up and discovering that you can't go out your front door. And that all seems relatively normal to me now. I'm not sure that it's healthy necessarily. But I do think that the challenge that we face in organisational spaces is to try and find ways of building collaborative, inclusive organisations that respect, for example, the thing that Alma pointed out, that 80% of people might not want to work in an office space. I think the allure of sitting in a queue of traffic or on a crowded train and paying a small fortune and emitting all kinds of carbon footprint to get to somewhere for a 9 o'clock start, to trudge around and then buy a cling film wrapped sandwich and do the same on the reverse on the way home, has left for a lot of people. So I think there's a real opportunity to shape a different kind of organisational form, which has different emphasis on what participation looks like and what leadership looks like and what productivity looks like. And I doubt that we would have got into this situation unless something forced us to. But from all the work that I've done on strategy, which often comes from a complexity theory perspective, you need these big interruptions to force you to innovate. And we are being forced to innovate at pace and in public.
Yeah, can I come in there if that's all right, Felicity?
Please, Alma.
Yeah, so Robert, I totally agree with you. I think it's about rethinking our sort of long established management practices and notions about management. One of the things that has come up in discussions that I've had, because people are really interested in the whole remote working, people who never had the chance before have got this chance, the people who it works for. There's a quotes way the people suppose that it doesn't work for, we are also cognizant of. But trust that employees, like if they're not physically present, it doesn't mean that they're not working. And our whole notion of how we manage people, we haven't really moved with the advances of technology. So this sudden crisis has forced an awful lot of organizations to let people engage with the technology that has advanced immensely in the last decade. But what's going to lag now is our notions of how we manage and how we organize organizations and people. And like how we manage performance has to change. The sort of you're present at work equals or is correlated, it doesn't equal to productivity. That was never the case in reality, but still our old notions of not giving people flexibility were somewhat based on that. Trust that people will do their best, where even if you can't see them, they might be working elsewhere, but they're doing their best. How we define tasks that people have to do, not about time. And a great quote that I heard in one of the debates that I was involved in is that, work is not a place we go to, it's a thing we do. And I think that, for organizations and managers and leaders, I think there's a huge mindset change required for us to kind of make that leap now, because technology has enabled us to do things very differently. And I think a lot of people, exactly as you say, Robert, who wants to be wasting time in Ireland, our M50 car park, caught in big cities, even today's event, like these webinars that we're involved with now, that we're participating in are fantastic. What would be the cost of us actually doing this physically in Dublin or Belfast? So I think there's an awful lot to be gained. My fear, though, is that the pendulum kind of will swing back. Unfortunately, that is a risk that is there. But I think that there's a lot of things that we've been forced to do and gives us the opportunity to test things that weren't tested heretofore.
I just add to that, Felicity. I think one of the interesting things is that from a marketing point of view, this sort of experience economy has been around for a while, where the whole notion of shopping centres moved from a place you went to buy something to a place you went to have an experience. And hence we see them fill up with restaurants and coffee shops and places to meet and interact and all of that. And I think this experience has allowed us to see our organizations and the places of work or something like that, that they're not destinations, as Alma said, but actually they're experiences. And there's certainly a younger group coming through that want a very different experience. They want to experience work as a part of their life. They want it to match their values. They want it to be a part of who they are and allow them to express themselves. And what the technology allows them to do now, very clearly, is to work remotely and in different places, not just from home, but to actually work for organizations that previously they mightn't have considered working for because of their physical locations. And I think there's a real challenge for any organization that wants to retain its top talent and gather the top talent coming through, to make sure that the experience of working in that organization is an exciting, engaging experience that people want to see as a part of their life, and not something that you have to put up with between Monday and Friday, so you can have your life on Saturday and Sunday. And I think that has been screamed home with people in the last while, that, you know what, it is actually possible to have it all. Well, maybe not at all, but quite a lot of it. And they certainly won't want to go back, and I don't want to go back to cling film wrapped sandwiches again.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And some of the comments coming through in the comment section are reinforcing the comments from the panel. For example, this idea of organizational rhetoric speaking out the new normal as a commitment, maybe back to Robert's earlier point, uncertainty is not the same as risk. So maybe we are in a continuous stage of liminality as well, which is important for us to consider. The next question is specific to the survey data presented by Alma. If I could ask, were there differences, Alma, in the responses of employees in other sectors to home working? So were there differences between private and public sector, or public and third sector?
Yeah, I just spotted that now, so I've taken out the full report for everyone, and largely or briefly the question, the answer really is no. So for the entire population, which included public, private, and third sector, 83% want to work remotely for some or all of the time. So 83 versus 80 just for public sector. And, you know, the stats are very similar for whether is that a couple of days a week or is that a couple of days a month, or so, yeah. So it's very similar statistics, and even the issues that are posed are the same in terms of the challenges and benefits. So I suppose, you know, I didn't see any difference really at a sectoral level, to answer the question. And thank you for that.
That's really helpful. And in terms of the wider context of the collaborative impacts, if 20%, for example, of the public sector workforce are going to be working remotely in the longer term, this goes to Marian's point as well in terms of this idea of remote workers. What is your sense as to the impact this is going to have on those individuals, but also on the potential for those individuals to collaborate fully with their colleagues?
Yes, so what we're seeing in the data is that it's a blended model, kind of a blended version that is absolutely the preferred approach, so that you would be some days at home, some days in the office. Because one of the challenges, of course, is the collaboration and some of the innovative ideas that come from, you know, the coffee conversations and the when we bump into people or meet people physically in one place. So I think that helps everybody, and it also helps the issue of isolation and feeling maybe engaged and connected. So I think that if we move to more of a blended model rather than wholly remote working, that kind of addresses a lot of the challenges that are there at an individual level and at an organizational level. But it is a big mindset change, and it's a change in how people are going to manage, how organizations manage that. The other challenge is, you know, that has been discussed, is we're all working remotely now. So everyone's experience, well, those of us, for example, in this context, most people, their colleagues, are working remotely also. So it's the same for everybody. It does become more challenging when some people are in the office and some people are out. So it does require a new way of thinking, and it's not straightforward, but it certainly does provide benefits to, you know, our survey there, what people are looking for. You know, the whole debate on work-life balance has been there for a long time, and people are really responding that it helps with managing childcare and things like that. That having that flexibility would really, really help. So that's just maybe a brief overview on that one.
Sorry, can I extend that particular question to the remainder of the panel? So if you're working in large quantities remotely, is it feasible for collaborative activity to remain at the level it is currently?
Well, can I just go over a little bit of research we did quite some time ago now about how you, if you're working in the same space and you want to build teams, you try and build emotional intelligence, people relating to each other. But when we were looking at, some years ago, we were looking at collaboration in distant teams. The nature of the psychological challenge leads you to some theories about efficient intelligence, not emotional intelligence, so as to help build collaboration and robustness into networks that never actually meet each other. So I've been working for about 15 years with a group of people who we only come together when we've got a problem to solve and all the rest of it, other than socially, we occasionally come together. But we learned how to know each other's effectiveness, how they think and what they would do in a situation, to such an extent now where most of the team leaders don't need to talk to the other people to know what they would do about a certain problem, because we've developed a knowledge of each other, how each other thinks. So it is possible to build greater resilience of networks in different places, usually across the world. People traveling to those to build those networks are probably wasting resources as it is, but it's just different from building emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is needed when you're in contact with people in the same office all the time. You can build resilience for remote working with people you hardly ever come into contact with.
Really interesting.
If I can just maybe just jump in there just for a second, I think there is an issue too about all the other crises that face us, not least the climate crisis, which is coming very, very, very quickly, or melting very, very quickly down the road at us. And the idea of more remote working, less travel, you know, being able to connect in different ways. I think we were all, certainly I was kind of skeptical about being able to do this amount of work online in these different ways, but you know, you get onto it very quickly, and of course it's different. You know, Pete is absolutely right in terms of that, but we do, you know, there are other things too, you know, not least the climate crisis, not least Brexit, which we've forgotten about, you know, all of these kind of big things that have to be taken into consideration as well. I suppose it's, what is it being called now? Build back better, I think is the terminology.
Robert, you had a comment?
I suppose for me, the issue around, for example, remote working and the effectiveness of teams and our ability to build relationships and so on in cyberspace as opposed to real space, it's a different form of the liminality that this conversation started around. You know, the ideas of what it takes to be an effective team were developed by people before technologies of this type existed, and of an age where that's what they grew up doing. So they're self-fulfilling prophecies of saying, well, knowing people means that you've got better chemistry with them, means that you can get more effective relationships with them. I look at my children and I watch that they've grown up immersed in this technology, and they see the actual thought of speaking to a real person as just one of a range of options that they have, and that they will watch television whilst using at least 2 other electronic devices at the same time. And I think we've been engaged in this mass experiment where a group of people who haven't had that experience, i.e. people of my age and upwards, have been forced into that situation and have discovered that actually it's not that bad. I mean, some of the people on this call I knew before this call, and it's been a delight to see them again, and others on this is the first time I've met them. And I'm not that fazed by the difference of the collaborative relationship. And I'm struck by the extent to which it's enriching, and it reduces borders, and it takes away sense of place. And it gives me personally and selfishly the privilege of spending my time with my loved ones without the commuting and so on. And I appreciate that. So I see only opportunity in that. And one of the questions that came up earlier in the chat facility was, what's that going to mean, for example, in relation to manufacturing? As somebody with a manufacturing engineering degree long, long ago, manufacturing is one of those things which is still going to require some people some of the time to be in a place. And of course you could 3D print things, but the assembly of things is different than the assembly of ideas or other types of work or paperwork or information. And so I think we're going to see a schism away from the sort of manufacturing versus service sector to what kinds of job are place specific, and they exist in manufacturing, but they also exist in hospitality and tourism, and what kinds of jobs are placeless. They could happen in this space. And so I think that's a really exciting place.
I think so, and I think it segues nicely into what that question was. So the question that was posed by the audience was, do our presenters feel the new normal, in inverted commas, will be largely based upon technologies such as Zoom and file sharing? And if so, how would that fit with the UK and equally Ireland Open for Business banner in terms of manufacturing and service sectors? So I think what Robert has started there is an insight into Alma's point that work is not a place, it's what you do. So I think that there's great potential there. It also, there's been some talk on the chat function around the benefits of local versus international, and the example given there was the PPE equipment. If the panel would like to speak to that in terms of the sense of local, international, global engagement now that we're in a COVID environment.
Sorry for this. That broke up for me at the end. It may have done for everyone.
I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it if you, can everyone hear me okay? You hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. So it was just the sense that in the context of COVID, there has been a balance required between local manufacturing and global manufacturing. And the example that was given in the chat was PPE provision, that it was this mix of local and global providers that provided the solution for the UK and Ireland. So in the context of what Robert and Joanne and others have talked about in relation to this new normal, what is the potential there for the balance between local and global now that we have this capacity for remote engagement?
Yeah, I'll kick in on that if you like for a second. There are two things I think, and they're different for different sectors. So the manufacturing one is probably the more challenging one to think about because of the physical manifestation of it, and you either do things locally or globally and not both at the same time, as you sometimes can with services. And our drive to move manufacturing effectively to low-cost places has just been driven on that. Just get the cost down on it, and it's been pretty dramatic in terms of what we've been able to do. But what's happened perhaps in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe even a little longer than that in terms of the manufacturing, is that manufacturing at high volume and high quality has become a really, really advanced art form and science form. And that art and science now lives often beyond the shores of America and the EU. And what we're seeing now is, well, so what happens when global is no longer global and we actually do have barriers to physically transport and need stuff. And I think what we'll see over the next decade is certainly in Ireland, I imagine the UK will do it on its own and the EU will do it, is to start looking at the resilience of the EU and the local systems to be able to survive any further shocks to the system like that. So what do we need to have capacity for and capability for locally? Not necessarily that we're doing the manufacturing, but at least the skill sets are somewhere within a geographical boundary that can be reasonably quickly accessed when we need them. We were sort of with the PPE stuff. In some ways, we were let off the hook on that one because we were able to use existing capacity in other industries where their markets had died completely. So we were able to move to people who had skill sets to manufacture other stuff. And we were able to use them to switch into PPE. But that being on top of a demand for something on top of the existing demand, we would have been in even more trouble. So, you know, it needs a sit back at a more national level to have a look at the challenges that we face in keeping our systems resilient and not letting skill sets drift completely off our shores.
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Robert was saying. In fact, I was going to talk a bit about resilience and the need for resilience and the need for capacity. But I still see that going back to sustainable development goals, to be honest. But the one point I'd say on top of that really was we've all become a lot more positive about skills and abilities to create local solutions and frankly, we've become more positive about local communities. The other thing that we've tended to see is that we've all become a lot more aware of international needs. You know, that it brings the sheer rise of COVID in places like Africa that's still to come and Latin America means that we're much more aware of those developing world's needs. And they're going to get worse if you get these integrated crises. Those disparities are not going to be helped by an integrated crisis. So to me, it comes back to this business about trust and integrity, trust in what we're doing, but in the integrity of our leaders. And what I worry about is what happens if we don't get that trust, if we don't have leaders who we think are publicly orientated or personally have high levels of integrity. Then we're into an awful surveillance society and all sorts of stuff. So I know that's a bit of a ragbag of comments, but I do think that we've got to take the best out of this and learn the lessons. Obviously, it's pretty obvious. But I do think there are some very clear, obvious lessons that will be easier to learn in the future or easier to assimilate. We've just seen the world almost focused on one issue wherever you are in the world for several months. And the one issue that I'm banging on about it again, but the one issue I think we need to focus on for a lot more than 3 months is climate change. So I do think there's an opportunity to bring that to the front of all recovery policies for not only for the UK or Ireland or the EU, but if we've got to see this as the opportunity to embed green development goals.
It's a very good point. Yes.
Can I follow on from what Peter was saying?
Please, Robert.
I think that there are some traditional dichotomies that we tend to fixate on about local or global and manufacturing versus service and so on. And I think what the crisis is doing is making us think of slightly more relevant dichotomies. So local, global will take on a particular flavour in my view, and it'll be around local enough to be resilient. And so, you know, shortening supply chains and your ability to do things without requiring to fly your guacamole all the way from Mexico, you know, can you do it locally? Those things are going to change in people's attitude. The other thing that I think is really going to change, which I mentioned earlier, is this idea of work which is place and work which is not place. And so, you know, the types of engagement with organisation will change. And then I think the third of those big dichotomies which are new to us is the difference between trusted and not trusted. I'd be really interested in the views of the people who are listening into this conversation. How many of you have thought, God, I wish we lived in New Zealand? Not because it's a beautiful country or they're great at rugby, but because they appear to be competent, you know. And I think there's a generational issue around trust in what governments tell you. It does seem to me that the newspaper footage that we've seen over the last day or two of the beaches of the UK is like a mass experiment with game theory and prisoner's dilemma. You know, I'll shield because I believe you're shielding them, and I see that you're not bothering. I think I'll stuff it. I'm going to go and have a barbecue on the beach. And, you know, the ability of our organisations, right from national structures down to the organisations that we choose to spend our time and careers with, and the extent to which we trust that they are being competently run, that's a big dilemma. Because if you don't trust, then you just begin to do your own thing.
Very good point in context. I'm conscious to get to all of these questions, so we just have two others, and also that we finish on time. So the first of these, in summary, because there's quite a bit that I've unpacked in this question, so apologies if it isn't as intended, but in summary, citizens have become more aware of the powers that governments have. While Wales and Northern Ireland is mentioned in the question, it's equally true of the Republic of Ireland, and I'm sure it's equally true of the other participants' nationalities or countries in which they're resident. So the question is, should we be analysing the impacts of these variations in the powers of government more systematically as a community?
I come in there.
Thanks, Alma.
Yeah, I suppose it has been very, very interesting watching watching different countries and how they respond. And as an island nation that's impacted by a lot of travel coming in and out, you know, people are, if those who are interested are tuned in to what other countries are doing, especially as we open up now, talking about air bridges to certain countries, concerned whether we're going to import cases back in and all of that. And I think what has been very interesting to watch is the impact of, you know, political leadership and the example that's being set. And, you know, I think what we see now that something like how this pandemic is being managed at a country level, a national level, is really, really important. You know, we're part of the EU, and that's obviously a very important player, but how we responded at a national level was very, very important. So in the Irish context, I think, and I mentioned it at the start, I think there was a very good level of connection between the political and public health leadership, and we were very lucky with our top epidemiologist here. He's very well regarded for the approach he took, and it seemed to work quite well. Looking abroad then at other countries, without necessarily naming them, you know, where there is that lack, I suppose, of coherent leadership, consistent messaging, you can see that citizens they don't come together as well. So it's a real challenge, the national level leadership. And I think there is a lot to be learned by looking at that and looking at countries like New Zealand and the stance that Jacinda Ardern took and the very strong approach there. It's kind of spoken about in a positive light. And, you know, if we look to the United States, you see a great division between the president's approach and what governors are trying to do at state level. And it's very, very problematic in the United States, you know, and I've family living there, so there's firsthand insight in different states there. So, you know, I think it's a very interesting question. And if we don't have trust, going back to Robert's point, if we don't have trust in the institutions and in our political leaders, and if they then cannot convey consistent, clear messages that people believe in, it's very hard to get citizens to follow suit. And the pictures, because those pictures from Brighton were shown here in the national media in Ireland, and it is a challenge, I think.
If I could just maybe come in there, I mean, I think there is a huge amount of interest in terms of how countries have managed the pandemic differently, and also how regions and these islands, I suppose, have maybe taken different responses at different times. I think, you know, Northern Ireland was sitting in this liminal space, you know, between GB and the Republic. And it was very interesting, you know, to observe different responses, you know, so, you know, and I mean, we've spoken about this, you know, offline, but the idea that there were clearly some border communities that decided to go with the response in the south rather than to go with the response in GB. But again, very informally, you know, so it was incredibly interesting to see the kind of movement that there was and also, I suppose, the difficulties around a political response in that situation. You know, you saw old divisions rise their head very, very quickly, but eventually people coming together. So really interesting and a fascinating thing, I'm sure, regionally, you know, all over these islands.
I think so, Joanne, and Amir had asked us that, what is the guidance for safe working environments for those who have to be present in their workplace? And it's even noticeable amongst the regions within Ireland and the UK that there are differences between the advice being given even in this small group of islands. So the challenges remain there in relation to what is perceived as safe in one environment is not being asked of their citizens in another environment. And as you know, Joanne, it's not that visible a line between the north and the south in practice.
We're back to Brexit again, unfortunately.
Exactly.
You know, the reality of an unimposable border, you know, and it's interesting because it was, you know, the border conundrum, you know, couldn't have been more obvious, couldn't have been more visible than in terms of this, you know.
Very true, because in terms of distances allowed, there was an anomaly between those who could travel and those who couldn't. And if your house happened to straddle the border, you had a difficulty there. If you turned left, you could go a certain distance. If you turned right, you were confined to 2 kilometres.
Although there was, I should say, there was quite a lot of amusing cartoons in the newspapers and in the media around a hard border and the need for a hard border very quickly. Yeah. So it was, particularly whenever cases looked like they were rising in one part of the island and not the other. So it, you know, it's very interesting, but it just shows that these things do not respect borders, as we know.
No, and it comes back to Alma and Robert's point, and others from the panel in answer to Amir's question, is that it is about trusting the government for doing the best for the community, and it is about the community taking ownership of the guidance. And so we're seeing that kind of anomaly created in each of our communities as a result. So the difficulty of the tensions of a guideline versus a law and or a regulation is also coming into interplay here. So these are the challenges around our world as much as around the wider communities we're working in. Unless there are comments in relation to that particular point, I have one other question, if it's acceptable. You're okay. So this question was raised much earlier, but I felt it was a good encompassing question as a completer. How important is it to review what we all did during the crisis when and if it ends?
I'm a big believer in learning from your experience, and so I think reflecting on what went well and not well would be a very sensible thing. It's not, I would be less inclined to treat that as an holistic, singular thing. I think that there will be phases of, you know, what could we learn from how abruptly we went into lockdown? There will be phases that we could learn from about how we have adjusted to what we saw initially as temporary. And if it does go on for a lot longer, I mean, there's this scientific confidence that there will be a vaccine, but, you know, that there may not be. And if it does go on for a lot longer and normalizes in a new way, there'll be a process of learning from how we've transitioned to that. The things that I'd be really interested in as an organizational scholar are the organizing processes and decision-making and governance issues and the kind of collective willpower of organizations to survive remoteness. That seems to me as an interesting topic, and I really look forward to reading in our journals those organisations and case studies that seem to have done better. But the thing that really fascinates me in the medium to longer term, and that I see as at least as worrying a challenge as some of the other climate change and sustainable development goal challenges that Peter and Joanne have talked about, is can we emerge out of this crisis with a nobler sense of inclusivity, sustainability and resilience in our organisational forms. You know, the lockdown and pandemic is described as being a singular experience when it definitely is not. If you're stuck in an underprivileged part of a city with less resource and less social capital and poorer broadband connectivity and impoverished, you're having a very different experience than elsewhere in the same town, city, region, country. And I think that that the inequalities that Peter talked about as health inequalities when he was speaking earlier, there's all kinds of inequalities in our society, and they're not healthy. They're not good for us. And so it's about trying to level up the bottom end rather than trying to focus on the most glamorous end of the top end of that for me.
I think because this is an event that's sponsored by 2 learned societies, the whole objective of those learned societies should be to try and maximize the learning out of this pretty fertile experience we've all been engaged in. So to me, it's appropriate subject to finish on, because if anybody has got the responsibility for thinking about what are the lessons that have come out of this, then surely learned societies around public management have, if nobody else.
Yeah, go ahead, Alma.
I suppose, you know, it's the longer term perspective, I suppose, in this pandemic, compared to, I think it's the last one, they talk about the Spanish flu, you know, nearly 100 years ago or whatever. Now we have, you know, a different world where we hopefully can capture and record things like lessons and that for whenever we'll be faced with such a crisis again. But the problem is sometimes history repeats itself, and the challenge I think for all of us is how do we try to keep lessons for somewhere at the forefront of when this might happen again, even if it's a once in a lifetime challenge. That is something that we should all think about, and definitely as scholarly associations, as Peter said there.
Really great, thank you, Alma. Thank you to all of the panel for their expertise and their involvement throughout the whole session. If I could pass back to Russ to wrap up the session, please.
Okay, thanks very much. I shall be brief, which those of you that know me will probably not expect, but I will. So thanks very much. I think we've had some really interesting discussion here, and our chance to sort of try and bring together a number of what might have felt like disparate perspectives, but actually I think have come together very nicely. We've moved through several dimensions about the scale and scope of the space that we need to consider, the context. We've looked at how staff will respond, the roles of leadership. We've looked at the policy landscape, the interface of politics and policy. And we focused, I think we've drawn out this issue around liminality, so things that are on the edges between policy, sector, people, the wider community. And I think for me, there have been sort of 2 really interesting points that I will take away. One is that there have been a number of axioms, I think, about how we run things in the broadest sense that have been found to be quite shaky. You know, we've seen some really interesting debates, I think, in the private sector about businesses taking government funding and then handing out shareholder dividends, and what that says about, that have started to kind of challenge this, perhaps some of the kind of orthodoxy around capitalism in some ways. And we've seen in the public sector, I think, you know, cliches about babies and bathwater aside, lots of significant changes, but what do we need to preserve and what do we need to change? And I think trying to look at the angles that allow us to kind of unpick that, I think, is fascinating for me. And then sort of finally, I think the one unifying factor for me that's come out really well is around trust. And I think this has come out through all of our speakers. So, you know, do we have trust in the integrity of our politicians? Do we trust our political, democratic, economic systems? You know, we're asking this kind of cui bono, who is benefiting from some of these changes? Do we trust our people, our staff, to do their jobs remotely? Do we trust our neighbours to protect our health and the health of our most vulnerable? Do we trust that we have sufficient community cohesion? Do we trust that the changes that we're going to make are justified? And do we trust that, I suppose, in a sense, you know, will pain be shared equitably? And maybe one of the questions I might finish with is, you know, do we trust that 2 computer screens in my home setup is enough for this new normal? And the answer to that is no, I don't. I need to get some more. So I really will just finish now, and I'd like to thank all of our contributors. So Felicity Callagher, Madeline Barrows, Robert MacIntosh, Joanne Murphy, Alma McCarthy, Pete Murphy, Robert Galavan. Richard Jeffries has been essential, has sort of kept quiet, but has been behind the scenes making the whole thing work, along with Rachel Lauder and all of the team at Queen's who've hosted. And again, thanks again to the William J. Clinton Leadership Institute for hosting us here. And I think finally, I'll embrace my Irish heritage. I'm 2/4 Irish, and I'll become Russ McGlennon, I think, for the next time. So I think my very one last thought is I'll say is perhaps one of, I think, the most well-known leadership management thinkers in the world today, Jerry Springer, used to say, you know, until next time, take care of yourself and each other. And it's been a real pleasure.